Ernest Hemingway was one of the more interesting practitioners of the so-called modern tradition, the practice of making art that was somewhat difficult and obscure, almost, the belief in art for art's sake. It's not supposed to educate you anymore. It's not supposed to make you a better person necessarily. It's supposed to be, it's supposed to operate with upon its own rules, essentially. It's supposed to be good or bad based on the criteria that art itself sets out. And so it becomes something that people have to work for a little bit more. It becomes a little bit more elitist. Not everybody could keep up with it. It's honestly in much of the Western world, it becomes a point when art starts to leave the broader population behind. High art becomes something that, after a long 19th century of becoming of a rising middle class who is engaging with art more, this is now high art starting to push those people away a little bit more. And you can, make of that what you will, but it leads to a lot of art that is necessarily more challenging, more abstract, more difficult, and some would say cold and kind of pointless, almost irrelevant in certain ways. It doesn't engage with the common. It doesn't engage with the common people in the same way. It demands that the people come to it instead of reaching out to engage the people. There are good and bad practitioners on either side of that question. What Hemingway does, Hemingway actually was very popular during his career while he was alive. And a lot of his stuff was and remains quite brilliant. He was a master of concise writing, a very deliberate, focused writing. When he was first starting out, he wrote a lot of short stories. It was a very common medium of the time in the early 20th century. Short stories were published in magazines and in some cases newspapers, and they were very popular, and they reached a very broad audience before, honestly, before TV and really as radio was starting to get picked up. This was what a working person could come home to at the end of the day. And, maybe you don't want to maybe you don't want to have a novel to get into. You just want something quick and short. People are always the same in that way. Quick and short is always a popular option. And they would come home, settle into their chair, and let's just see this. We'll spend just a few minutes. And Hemingway was an especially good practitioner of that because he wrote in very tight prose. He wrote in very specific, narrow terms that translates well to a short media. When he writes some of the longer stuff, when he becomes the great novelist, some of his novels become a little bit more hit and miss. But in those little tiny moments, he is really quite extraordinary. He really has remarkable command of the art of writing. And he teaches in a large part, although art is not supposed to be educative, he teaches people how to read in a very close way, which is, for many people, a great introduction into the skill of reading. After a while, people get very jaded about Hemingway, and after a while, people will say, "Well, I can't really take that. That's just silly stuff. That's just, it's all right. I get it." No, but he forces you to slow down, to really calculate and calibrate the moment by moment sensations that literature produces. Hills Like White Elephants is one of his better stories of this period, and it's quite remarkable outside the little the puzzle of it. It is a puzzle piece in that he gets through the entire story. It's not long, it's only a couple of pages long. He gets through the entire story without actually ever saying what it's about. And the secret to it that everybody finds is that it's about abortion. A couple is waiting to go to hospital so that the woman can have an abortion. And they're having a little conversation at this particularly fraught moment of their lives. This is the explanation that was given to me when I first read this story in high school. That's the explanation given to everybody anytime they open it up. You can come to the story and say, well, I'm not sure, because it never really gets that far. It leaves it open. You can only pull together the clues, the subtext of it, the little hints here and there on tiny, minute bases to try and figure out if it all adds up to abortion. And that is necessarily inconclusive. There is no way to know. That's part of the fun. But along the way, it teaches you an awful lot about how to read, and quite frankly, by extension, how to write. Because subtext matters. It's not just what you say. Sometimes it's what you don't say that communicates loudest. The hills across. Watch how he opens too. It's a famous opening, and specific for well, it's a famous opening, and really interesting for one particular reason that I find. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. On this side there was no shade and no trees, and the station was between two lines of rail in the sun. Close against the side of the station there was the warm shadow of the building, and a curtain made of strings and bamboo beads hung across the open door into the bar to keep out flies. It's an interesting little opening for how boring it is, how dull it is, how flat it is. It's not necessarily jazzy. Just look at that first thing, that first stretch. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. One sentence. Well, it does a couple of things. First of all, it's the Ebro. It's a river in Spain. So anybody reading this in, let's say, Peoria, Illinois, would say, ooh, I'm cavorting in Spain right now. This is so interesting. So maybe that's appealing. Maybe that's a selling point. Maybe, the pictorial element of it. But, the valley, the hills, it doesn't really jazz it up. There are no adjectives here. There's no real grabber. Well, long and white are adjectives, but they're about as bland an adjective as you can get. But what's more curious, I find, and what is very, very Hemingway, is his use of verbs. The hills across the valley of the Ebro were long and white. To be, it's about as neutral and uninteresting a verb as you can find. On this side, there was no shade and no trees across the station. Was between two lines of rails in the sun. The close against the side of the station, there was this side, the warm shadow of the building. Was, were, to be, to be, to be. Very dull, flat words. Now, any creative writing class would tell you, well, try and stay away from that. Make your verb choices really interesting. Have them be really dynamic. And so, maybe you would come up with something like, the hills across the valley of the Ebro stretched long and white into the distant horizon, or something like that. Stretched gives you a sense of dimension, gives you a sense of dynamism, and it is infinitely more interesting on its surface, then whir, whir. Whir doesn't do anything. Whir doesn't reach out and take you by the hand and guide you along and sweep you off your feet. Whir just presents itself to you. This is it. Make of it what you will. It's not necessarily interesting. It's up to you to make it so. And that's modernism. It's not the art's job to make itself interesting to you. You have to take the first step. But it's also tied into the general theme of the piece, because the entire story is about saying nothing and the communicative value of saying nothing. And here, the text itself, the opening words, beginnings and endings are always so important. The opening words of the piece say as little as possible. They leave it to you to fill in the blanks, to do the work. Saying more by saying nothing. It is a work of enormous discipline and control. Hemingway was good at that. He knows what to say, he knows what details to leak, and he knows what not to say to get you to come out of your shell a little and share the burden. And he does this through a variety of techniques throughout this story. It's a very pedestrian little scene that he's drawing. It's at a train station, and this couple is just sitting there waiting, and they're just chatting, filling the time because they have to wait for the train to show up. And there's a bar there. They're sitting at the table. They're having a drink. It's Hemingway. They're always going to have a drink. They talk about what they're going to drink, and of course, the Hemingway stand-in, the man, always says, he always knows the right thing to drink at the time, and this is what you have to drink in this situation, and this is the way you have to drink it. Hemingway was a massive alcoholic, so this takes up a considerable amount of his total word count, I assure you. Anything about drinking, it's fun, but bear in mind where it led him. The woman, the waitress, brings 2 glasses of beer and 2 felt pads. She put the felt pads and the beer glasses on the table and looked at the man and the girl. The girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. They look like white elephants, she said. This is the girl. First of all, she's the girl. The waitress is the woman. The girl, she's pregnant. So girl might be a little unnecessarily condescending or infantilizing or whatever you want to call it, but leave that aside. You're not going to get remarkable female characters in here, although he does do some interesting things, as we'll kind of get to. They look like white elephants. That is her observation. That is what she thinks. Now, first of all, the girl was looking off at the line of hills. They were white in the sun, and the country was brown and dry. So we've heard about these white hills again. It's like, well, that was the very first sentence. We're long and white. The hills were white. All right, I get it. It's repetitive. Another thing they're going to tell you in any creative writing class is don't repeat yourself. And here, he's repeating himself in just the first few lines. Why? What is the effect of that? I get impatient with it. I want to know, why are you wasting my time doing this? Well, he's just sort of looking to point out that he's wasting time. Mine, perhaps, is certainly there, looking to pass the time, to fill the silence with nothing, because the silence is uncomfortable. And one of the things about silence is you never know what the other person is going to start talking about that you do not want to talk about. But she very specifically takes it even a step a little further, and she She looks at the hills, and they're no longer just hills like they have been. They were hills, were long and white. She's looking, and she's bringing a little imagination to it. She's saying, oh, they look like white elephants. She is extrapolating. She is abstracting. She's letting her mind get taken somewhere. That is dangerous. That is out of control. The Hemingway figure in here wants to keep everything very simple, very controlled. She is being a little unpredictable, because once you start thinking representationally, once you start thinking in terms of metaphors and similes, and that reminds me of something else, and once you start freeing your mind like that, it can go anywhere, and that is not what this guy wants to do right now. I've never seen one. The man drank his beer. Just cutting that off right there. No, you wouldn't have. I don't know what that means. It's a little bit of a slight. It feels like it's got a barb to it. Everything that they say, again, very little description. This is just dialogue. Every little line of dialogue seems to have a little bit of an attitude to it, because you can imagine what they're saying, and the sharpness of it, the lack of expression of how they're supposed to be saying it, implies an awful lot more. You get the sense that some of this is really quite sarcastic, some of this is really quite muted, some of this is openly hostile. No, you wouldn't have. I might have, the man said, a little snippy, a little offended. Just because you say I wouldn't have doesn't prove anything. They're a little bit edgy here. You got to be careful. The girl looked at the bead curtain. They've painted something on it. What does it say? Painted art? I don't know. Could be a couple of different ways. He is very happy to announce right away that it is an advertisement for a kind of liquor. Anís del Toro. It's a drink. Could we try it? The man called. Listen, through the curtain, in Spanish. The woman came out from the bar. 4 reales. We want 2 Anís del Toro. With water? Do you want it with water? I don't know, the girl said. Is it good with water? It's all right. Again, the guy in Hemingway always knows how to drink. Yes, with water. Okay, you want them with water? Asked the woman. Yes, with water. Next line. It tastes like licorice, the girl said, and put the glass down. That is quick service. I want to go there. They got that drink right there. This is a moment when they have a bit of a time jump, and normally you would get a writer coming in and saying, and then the waitress went inside, spent a few moments, brought the drinks out, they sipped it, and the girl put hers down, thought reflectively, and said. None of that is included. The reader is just expected to keep up. That's the way with everything. Yes, said the girl, everything tastes of licorice, especially all the things we've waited so long for, like absinthe, which is another drink. They're just filling the time. You're getting bored listening to this because they're bored saying it. Oh, cut it out. He gets frustrated with this line of conversation. He's just, stop it. You started it, the girl said. I was being amused. I was having a fine time. I don't believe it's having a fine time. Well, let's try and have a fine time. All right, I was trying. I said the mountains looked like white elephants. Wasn't that bright? That was bright. A little condescending, but mollifying, just trying to make the tension go away. He wants to sit there, he wants to have his drink, he wants the train to come so they can go to the city, so that they can go to the hospital, and they can get this over with. And he will be in control of all of that. They have this ongoing snippiness. Much of it without what we would call speech tags. You never really know, except in very narrow points, who is speaking. You don't get a he said, she said on every line. It actually comes increase or decreasingly as the story goes on, so that at a certain point you're like 2/3 of the way into the story and you've got this long stretch of dialogue, one line and then another line and then another line, where it's just the line of dialogue. You don't know who is speaking, and then you have to kind of start flipping back and saying, well, all right, now, okay, this one says she said, so the next line is he said, and the line after that is she said, and you count through it like that, and because you're not quite certain. All it is this sort of empty language bouncing back and forth. It doesn't really matter at a certain point who is saying what. It is just language filling the space, the empty space between them. It is also, from another perspective, you're never quite sure who is upset at different times. At certain points, she is more angry. At certain times, he seems more angry. And there is a certain blurring of identity there. You're never quite sure who is whom. And there you get into a little bit of male-female stuff, quite honestly. The character of the man is sometimes indistinguishable on the words of the page, the surface, from the character of the woman. And this is frustrating. This is maddening at times. But they have this little back and forth. No, we can't. We can have the whole world. No, we can't. We can't go. We can go everywhere. He is lying to her. These little lies are seeping out. He's just saying, oh, this doesn't matter. He keeps saying, oh, it's just a simple thing. It's a perfectly simple operation. He keeps repeating that word perfectly, as if it's so antiseptic. But it's not perfect. It has some emotional toll to it. And it's boiling under the surface, and he just wants to tamp that down. And at a certain point, he keeps lying to her, saying, "Oh, it's simple. It's nothing. We'll get it done. Then we'll go back to things the way they always were, and it's going to be great." And yes, it's perfectly simple. He says at one point, "I do anything for you," which you get the sense is really kind of a lie. I don't get the sense, based on the communication here, that their relationship is going to survive this little crisis. I think this is a sign of growing estrangement between them. They are not communicating in any way, shape, or form. So he says, lying, I do anything for you, which is another repetition. He just keeps saying the same thing over and over and over again. And then she comes back and says, would you please stop talking? Heavy repetition. And you sense the frustration, anger, the fury building up in her, that she just wants him to shut up with the lying. It's not necessarily the talking that's bothering her, it's the lying. He keeps saying all these banal little lies. Oh, this doesn't mean anything. I'll do anything for you, hon. I don't believe it for a second. Oh. The woman came out through the curtains with 2 glasses of beer and put them down on the damp felt pads. The train comes in 5 minutes, she said. What did she say? Asked the girl. That the train was coming in 5 minutes. The girl smiled brightly to the woman to thank her. That's an odd emotional reaction to just a simple thing like that, but it is so simple. The old woman, the waitress, was providing real information to her, was not lying, was just giving her a simple statement of fact. And at this point, the girl is buried in all of these lies and all of this bullshit that she just can't stand anymore. And here is this older woman, presumably older woman, I'm imagining it so, I don't know it for a fact, presumably older woman, a waitress who just comes and tells her one thing she can believe in. And what she can believe in, not him, not the power of love, not the meaning of it all, but just the fact that the train will come in 5 minutes. He picked up the two heavy bags and carried them around the station to the other tracks. He looked up the tracks but could not see the train. They keep looking at things and not seeing anything. Coming back, he walked through the bar room where people were waiting for the train. People waiting for the train were drinking. He drank an anise at the bar and looked at the people. They were all waiting reasonably for the train. He went out through the B curtain. She was sitting at the table and smiled at him. "Do you feel better?" he asked. He just killed some time, got out, filling some time. "Do you feel better?" he asked. "I feel fine," she said. "There's nothing wrong with me. I feel fine." And here she lies. She fills the silence with a lie. She doesn't feel fine. No reading of this would suggest that she feels fine, but she is willing to lie to just get through this experience. And that is Hemingway's irony dripping off the page. You can read through this whole thing and wonder, what happened? I don't really get it. But if you just think about it and you gauge those little reactions as the style goes along, you can draw out all of this from subtext. It's not in the words, it's in what's underneath the words, the hostility, the frustration, the emotion, the antagonism that comes out in every single line. Style can do that. Style can teach you how to communicate by not saying something, by refraining from saying something, by perhaps being delicate, perhaps being very straightforward, perhaps being very literal, but never giving too much so that your reader, your audience, buys into the process and suddenly becomes a partner in making meaning. And that's what modernism does. And that's what Hemingway does as good as any of them, to be perfectly honest. When he is good, he is very, very good. And this is that. Him making you get off your butt and join in the active making of meaning in literature.